Every year, the church celebrates the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead on the feast of Easter and throughout the whole Easter season. The season of Easter begins with the Easter Vigil on the Saturday night before Easter Sunday. The Easter Vigil begins outside with a fire. The priest blesses our new Paschal candle, and from the fire that we've lit outside, we light that Paschal candle. The Paschal candle represents Christ himself, the resurrected Christ. We then process into the church, and all the lights in the church are turned off. It's as if we are entering into the empty tomb, and everybody entering has their own candle that was lit from that Paschal candle, from the one light of the world, from Christ himself. It's a long Mass with lots of readings, sacraments, and all the usual stuff that you would typically find in a Mass. But it's the most glorious celebration of the year. So why do we even do this? I mean, why do we take hours out of a Saturday night to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus from the dead? Well, perhaps there's an even more important, an even more foundational question that we need to ask. And that question is, did Jesus really rise from the dead? In some ways, all of our questions about theology and religion come back to this question. Did Jesus truly rise from the dead? Because truthfully, everything the Catholic Church teaches hinges on whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. Even St. Paul says that if Christ has not been raised, our faith is in vain. So if Jesus hasn't raised from the dead, then what we believe as Catholics just isn't true. But if Jesus has been raised from the dead, then everything the Catholic Church teaches follows from that. The resurrection of Christ is the center point of Catholic teaching, and everything else stems from his resurrection. So is it true? Did Jesus really rise from the dead? Well, first let's look at what the Bible says about the resurrection, and we can see if it holds up. According to the Bible, there were some women who claimed that Jesus' tomb was empty after he had died on the cross and been laid to rest in that tomb. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James, went to Jesus' tomb to anoint him. And when they got there, they were met by angels who told them that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And when they went to tell Jesus' disciples about all this, they were met by Jesus himself on the road, the resurrected Jesus, who told them not to be afraid, because fear would be a natural thing in that sort of situation. And then he told them he would present himself to the disciples. Then we have the apostles themselves who saw Jesus, and Jesus says, "Peace be with you." Well, all the apostles except one, Thomas. And when the other apostles told Thomas that they'd seen Jesus resurrected, Thomas didn't believe it. He said, "I'll believe it if I can put my finger in the nail marks in his hands." A week later, Jesus appeared to Thomas as well and said, "Place your fingers in the wounds in my hand and in my side." And Thomas fell down and said, "My Lord and my God." In the scriptures, St. Paul even tells us that Jesus appeared to over 500 people at one time after he'd resurrected. And Paul even says most of these people are still alive, so when he wrote this, you could go talk to them and ask them about what happened. So according to our scriptures, Jesus was crucified, died, and was buried. And then he rose again on the third day. But even back then, even 2,000 years ago, when all of these events were pretty new, not everybody believed that Jesus actually rose from the dead. Here are three common objections in the ancient world to Jesus' resurrection. Number one, they say the disciples stole Jesus' body. The scriptures tell us that the authorities were worried the disciples might try to steal Jesus' body, so they put a seal on the tomb So they would know if anybody tried to get in, and they wouldn't be able to get in because there was a large stone rolled in the way, and they put Roman guards outside of the tomb to make sure the disciples wouldn't come to steal the body. But even besides that, we have to ask, what motivation would the disciples have for stealing Jesus' body? I mean, they were afraid for their lives. When Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, they fled. They left him. They took off. They were scared. Why would they go to steal Jesus' body knowing that they might be killed trying to do so? I mean, if they weren't willing to go to their death with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, why would that have changed after Jesus had endured a brutal, torturous death that they would probably be subject to as well? It's not like they would have wanted to steal his body to lay him in a better tomb. He was already in a rich man's tomb. Joseph of Arimathea, a kind of secret follower of Jesus, took the body and laid him in his own tomb. But what's interesting about this objection is that even the early critics of the resurrection acknowledged that the tomb was empty. So they had to come up with some sort of explanation. So they said, well, the disciples stole the body. Ancient objection number 2. They were all hallucinating. They said the women who went to the tomb were hallucinating when they saw the angel and when they saw Jesus on the way back. They said the apostles were hallucinating when they saw Jesus in the upper room, and Thomas was hallucinating when he put his fingers in Jesus' wounds. And there could be some legitimacy to that. I mean, of course, the apostles and the followers of Jesus were in grief. And when we're in grief, our minds don't always fire on all cylinders, I guess. So it's possible that you could hallucinate someone who has passed, whom you loved, who you've spent a lot of time with. But what about the 500 people that St. Paul talks about, who all saw Jesus together at one time? I mean, for one person to hallucinate, sure, that's one thing, that happens. But for 500 people all together to hallucinate the same thing, well, that's not how hallucination works, right? Hallucination is in the individual person's mind. So 500 people can't all hallucinate the exact same thing at the same time in the same place. So if what St. Paul tells us is true, that over 500 people saw Jesus at once, then that makes the hallucination theory kind of difficult to maintain. Ancient objection number 3. Resurrection is impossible. Look, sometimes we like to think of people 2,000 years ago as being primitive or, not understanding the world scientifically, but they knew a lot of things. They were very intelligent people, and they knew that people don't just rise from the dead. But notice, this is an assumption. It's not actually an argument about whether or not Jesus rose from the dead, because if people are saying he did, you need to come up with something better than, well, that just doesn't happen. Because if you have an underlying assumption that makes it impossible for you to take what someone's saying seriously, then maybe there's something off with your assumption. So there's a difference between what's possible and what's normal. The scriptures tell us that all things are possible for God. It doesn't mean that all things are normal, right? We live ordinary lives, and for the vast majority of us, all that we'll encounter in our lives are ordinary things. But extraordinary things have happened throughout history, and extraordinary things happen today, things we call miracles. And we call them extraordinary because they are extraordinary. They are more than ordinary. And if Jesus did truly rise from the dead, then it was certainly extraordinary. So those were some of the objections that people made to the resurrection 2,000 years ago. But what about today? Today there are a lot of people who also don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. So what are the objections that they make? Objection number 1. They'll say the resurrection is just a myth, right? Like other Greek mythology or, and any other myth that we may encounter. The problem with this is that if the resurrection of Christ is just a myth, then there's really no plausible explanation for why the church exists. Remember, when Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane, his followers abandoned him. And Jesus wasn't the only one during that time who claimed to be the Messiah. There were other people who rose up claiming to be the Messiah and leading a movement, and they had followers, but eventually those would-be Messiahs died and their followers disbanded. And that's exactly what would have happened with Jesus' followers unless something major, something extraordinary, happened after he was crucified to bring them all back together and empower them to go out and preach that Jesus was risen from the dead. I mean, why would these men who abandoned Jesus out of fear suddenly decide to start teaching a lie that Jesus was raised from the dead, knowing that teaching that lie would probably lead to their death? And almost all of the apostles who were preaching that Jesus rose from the dead were martyred, were killed in horrific ways because they were preaching that Jesus rose from the dead. If that were a lie, if this resurrection were just a myth that they had made up, why would they go to their death for it? The apostles had nothing to gain. They weren't gaining any power by claiming Jesus rose from the dead. They weren't gaining money. They weren't gaining status. They were instead putting their lives on the line. And that's just not something you do for a lie. Especially men like the apostles, who had been somewhat cowardly prior to encountering the resurrected Christ. Modern objection number 2. We can't trust ancient writings. I guess, why not? Why can't we trust ancient writings? We seem to trust any other ancient writings, but if it's scripture, if it's from the Bible, a book where we have more manuscripts than any other text in history, why can't we trust that what its authors are telling us are true? Why can't we trust that when they are writing about things that actually happened, that those things actually happened? I mean, sure, there are different genres in the Bible. Not every book of the Bible is meant to convey things that happened in history, but the Gospels clearly are trying to tell us that Jesus actually rose from the dead. Again, this kind of goes to that bias of thinking that people 2,000 years ago were primitive or gullible, which just isn't true. They were human beings like you and me. They were massively intelligent. But the reason that modern people say we can't trust these particular ancient writings really relates to objection number 3, which is the same as the ancient objection. Resurrection is impossible. It just doesn't happen. Right, so we approach it with this sort of mindset of, well, resurrection can't really happen, so if they say that resurrection happened, then they must be making it up, a myth, or they must be gullible and believed something that modern people would see right through. But again, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, why would the church exist at all? Why would we be going to Mass on Sundays? Why would we be doing things like the Easter Vigil? If Jesus hadn't risen from the dead, that would have been the end of it. His movement would have stopped, just like any other movement of that time and place. But instead, it flourished. Instead, people said they were encountering Christ, risen from the dead. Instead, people's lives were changed. So those are some of the objections to the resurrection and some of the reasons to believe the resurrection. Maybe you can come up with some more for either side. But for me, I always think that the most compelling reason to believe the resurrection is that the early Christians were willing to go to their death for this belief. When you tell a lie, you usually run with that lie until it's no longer advantageous for you to continue with that lie. And if you know that someone will kill you if you keep spreading that lie, that's usually a pretty good reason to stop telling that lie. But the apostles didn't stop, even when it meant their death. And neither did countless other Christians all throughout the last 2,000 years. And even today, people's lives are changed by the risen Christ. We believe Christ is risen from the dead not only because an ancient text tells us, and not only because ancient Christians went to their death for this belief, but because we know this risen Christ. Because we have a relationship with this Christ. Because our lives have been changed by this Christ. Now please read the material below and answer the reflection questions. Have a great week.